the sense of unity in the face of resistance, I think, is really important. Unity doesn't mean not disagreeing. It doesn't mean not having debates and discussions and promoting people's positions and allowing a minority to exist. But what it does mean is when time to act, the enemy is the capitalist and you are with the workers, right? So the society that we're trying to produce needs a unified struggle. Doesn't mean it's an agreeable struggle, but it's a unified struggle. And I think that is the most, again, I'll say this again, solidarity is an action verb. It's not a metaphor. It's work. And to bring solidarity into our work is going to be the most important. If we're going to win, and I want to win, I'm not interested in doing, I've been organizing for 30 years. I'm not interested in doing this so people can talk about me at my funeral. I want to win. I want the working class to win. And I'm going to organize for them to win. Not to be right, not to feel vindicated, to win.
Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. What you just heard is a snippet of this episode's discussion. If you're a new listener, this show is a podcast dedicated to exploring past, present, and future manifestations of real-world socialism by speaking to those who've studied extensively, lived in, or currently live in a socialist nation. Today we're talking about one of the few remaining actually existing socialist nations, Cuba. Our two guests today, Calla Walsh and Aeron, are representatives of the National Network on Cuba, the NNOC. The National Network on Cuba is a coalition of over 50 organizations across the US working together to end the US blockade on Cuba. The focus of this first part of a two-part conversation, we look at ways we can all act in solidarity with Cuba and why it's actually a duty for those of us on the left to do so. We also talk about this year's International May Day Brigade, and with both Calla, who is now a co-chair of the NNOC, and Aeron, learned in Cuba and how these experiences have influenced their organizing efforts at home in the US, or as Che Guevara called it, the belly of the beast. Coming up on June 25th, 2023, there will be protests happening across North America regarding the removal of Cuba from the US's state sponsor of terrorism list. So recommend looking up if any of these protests are occurring locally to you. If you haven't already, I also recommend checking out the previous episode I did with Calla, where she did a real deep dive into Cuban democracy, comparing it to American democracy. Aeron is a newcomer to the show and a member of the Michigan General Defense Committee. You'll learn more about his organization and his work, as well as his experiences in Cuba, in our discussion. More info regarding this episode can be found at patreon.com/AESthepodcast. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a subscriber, you will gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. Shout out to my patrons. If you're unable to contribute, no problem. You can also help by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to this show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Also, feel free to write a review if you have time. You can also check out the back catalog of episodes when you have the chance. Most importantly, you can help out by engaging in local worker struggles and by standing in solidarity with Cuba. I'd like to welcome both Calla and Aeron to the show. It's great to have both of you today to talk about Cuba, to talk about solidarity with Cuba, to talk about this year's International May Day Brigade, and to talk about the US's insane listing of Cuba as a state sponsor of terror.
Thanks for having us.
To give a little bit of historical grounding for our discussion, I went on a search to find the original quote and context of a Che Guevara quote. And so it's quite relevant to our discussion, the story behind it, and the quote itself. And so I'm going to be quoting from a book by Jerry Rubin. If you have watched the movie Chicago 7, it's a Netflix movie about really some new left hippie activists in the 1970s. It's on Netflix. The character played by Jeremy Strong in that movie is Jerry Rubin. So if you want to learn more about him, that movie is definitely one way to do so. And so in 1964, Jerry Rubin, who was a leftist organizer at the time, went to Cuba. And I'm just going to read a little portion from his biography called Growing Up at 37. Here's the quote. I heard that a radical organizer was in town looking for 80 volunteers to go on an illegal free trip to Cuba. That struck my fancy. If the government didn't want us to go, there must be something to see. Since travel to the island was outlawed, we had to go to the 90-mile trip from Florida to Cuba via a most circuitous route. We flew to Paris, where we got on a plane to Czechoslovakia, where we boarded Cubana Airlines to fly back across the Atlantic to Havana. 13,000 miles to go 90 miles. When the plane landed in Cuba, all 80 of us cheered. We've arrived in the free world. We'd outsmarted the CIA and made it to Cuba. Cuba transformed my consciousness. I saw with my own eyes how the victims of American imperialism had translated abstract dreams into reality. The fancy hotels in Havana, once gambling casinos and prostitution havens for American businessmen, had been turned into schools and homes for the poor. Students graduating from medical schools went to the hinterlands to serve the peasants, and the entire society was putting into practice the Christian ideal of fellowship. Why then was America determined to destroy the Cuban Revolution? Cuba had set a bad boy example for the rest of South America. Washington resented Cuba's breakaway from being a plantation economy, serving American corporate interests. Cuba had to be smashed. We listened to Fidel Castro speak for 7 hours to 200,000 people. Then, a few weeks later, he and the Cuban cabinet played a 10-inning baseball game with American newspapermen who were visiting Cuba for the first time in years. Fidel pitched Cuba to a 26-2 victory, giving America a message in terms it could understand. So now we're actually getting to the Shea's quote in all of this. I looked at the Cuban people and envied their revolutionary spirit, their enthusiasm and aliveness. I wanted to stay and live there. The Cuban said, "No, your struggle is in America." We interviewed Che Guevara, the Minister of Labor, who was already secretly planning to leave Cuba to spread the revolution elsewhere. He blew my mind when he told us that if he had a choice, he'd return to North America with us. Che said, "The most exciting struggle in the world is going on in North America. You live," Che said, "in the belly of the beast." With that historical context and a quote from Che, what is solidarity with Cuba? What does that look like? What does that mean? What is the importance of that connection as exemplified in the story I just told?
Well, thank you for reading that quote. It's a great one, and it's one that we bring up a lot while we're in Cuba because I think the basic answer to that question is that as US people, we should stand in solidarity with Cuba because our government's current policy towards Cuba is economic strangulation and these covert CIA programs to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And so it's our basic duty to take a stand against that. And I think the deeper answer is because despite suffering under this cruel blockade, Cuba is centuries ahead of us in so many ways in their healthcare system, their education, how they organize their democracy and actually have representation of all people. And so by going to Cuba, we have a chance to learn from an actually existing socialist country that has survived and accomplished so much despite being under the longest, most severe unilateral sanctions in the history of the world. And just to give a couple examples of what solidarity with Cuba looks like, first of all, traveling to Cuba, learning from the Cuban reality outside of this propaganda we're fed in the US and in other capitalist countries, going there, bringing medical donations, bringing products that are deprived from Cuba because of this cruel blockade, and speaking to the Cuban people, learning from Cuban mass organizations and people who are working for the revolution every single day. And bringing back that truth to the US. But there's also a lot of work we can do, even if we're not, on the ground in Cuba, because, that's our duty to be in the belly of the beast and to be struggling against the monster. So some of the work that my organization, the National Network on Cuba, does is pressuring the government to end the blockade through protests, through lobbying, through passing resolutions in city councils and labor unions, doing political education, and really trying to show people the reality of the blockade, and not necessarily people who are, very conscious socialists, communists, anti-imperialists, trying to reach all people and tell them, this blockade is not just a blockade of trade. It is a blockade of people, and it is a blockade of, contact and between our two countries and all these amazing things we could learn from Cuba. So yeah, that's my part, and I'll let Aaron jump in since I'm sure he has something to add.
Thinking about what solidarity looks like is for some people, it's because you've never traveled there or something like that. It seems like something that is a theoretical question, but solidarity the word is an action verb. So it's about work and it's about action. And I think what Kyle just said about duty, and I think this is something that sometimes is missed in the left, that we have a duty. And I think that's what Che was talking about in that quote too. We have a duty to the world to organize against imperialism. I think a lot of our Cuban comrades are amazed that there are revolutionaries in the United States doing this work because they just think it must be impossible. And in many ways, they're right. The area that we organize in is behind enemy lines, where they're defending free territory. And that's a different kind of struggle, right? So our struggle is behind enemy lines. The war against Cuba and all imperialist stuff. So what I look at my view, with my work, is to attempt to put pressure and struggle in the United States to allow other places the sovereignty to decide for themselves the path that they want to go, right? So it's not mine to tell Cuba what to do, but it is mine to work to intervene on the pressure my government and the capitalists do to pressure Cuba to bend the knee, right? And so there's many ways to do that. And I think Cal talked about some of the economics stuff, and we'll probably talk about this more, but there's a political and ideological war against Cuba too. And that takes place in all kinds of devious, mischievous ways. It's no longer this kind of just hammer over the head, but it's using the left's words against Cuba. It's using kind of the language of liberalism and identity against Cuba. It's using gas lines as proof of failure when actually the gas lines come from the blockade. All this stuff needs to be countered. So even when you're on, say, for example, Twitter, you can counter that stuff yourself just by saying, this is a lie, mentira. Mentira, 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 right? And I think that we have that's just like par for the course. If you're on Twitter and you see a lie against Cuba, a slander against Cuba, you have to step in. But the other stuff that I think is essential and is not the kind of sexy stuff is the day in, day out organizing. So organizing your workplace helps Cuba. Organizing tenants helps Cuba, because what it does is it produces solidarity here, which can translate to solidarity with Cuba. And we had a saying, I think, Cal, talk about this a little bit, that the same people that stop medical supplies from going to Cuba are the same people that stop you from getting medical care here. Right? The same people that stop Cuba from receiving construction supplies are the same people that destroy our infrastructure here. So that kind of solidarity, while it's not as sexy as the "you're a liar" on Twitter, is the work that needs to be done.
A point that I'm kind of drawing from both of you here. In my own personal journey, moving from, say, for example, a social democrat to a socialist proper, the thing that made me really understand the difference was this concept of solidarity. Worker solidarity internationally over, say, for example, nationalism within the country or a form of social imperialism. Understanding that the entire economic system that we currently live under is based really, for those in North America, on the suffering of billions of people in the global south. And that's something that I think is maybe lost in translation in North America when it comes to leftist discourse, is this idea of only focusing on our country. And even if our country, and I think, Callie, you talked about this in our first discussion, you can have someone fighting for Medicare for all, but then they're for, the apartheid in Israel, or they're for the blockade on Cuba. So yeah, thanks for really giving those clear understandings on the importance of solidarity. So can you give some more specific ways we can stand in solidarity with Cuba? Like, say, for example, Calla, I think it was on your Twitter a couple months ago, you were taking donations for medical supplies. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope I can give a clear response. It's hard because there's a lot of different ways we can organize in support of Cuba. And like Aeron said, even if it's not, an organizational cause where the material things you're doing are directly going to Cuba, struggling against capitalism and imperialism in the US, like as a whole, whether it's unionizing, whether it is like doing political education with your neighbors, whether it is organizing your building, that also, all helps Cuba because it's resisting against the ruling class in the US, that is the ruling class upholding the blockade on Cuba. It's not the US people who want this blockade, it's the US ruling class. But, one of the first ways that I want to share people can support Cuba is by participating in the upcoming June 25th protests, which the NNOC is organizing to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. I think we're going to talk about that more later on, so I won't go into too much detail, but that's a great way to meet people in your community, in your city. There's going to be protests all over the US, all over Canada, and other countries too. And then you can meet people in your community who've been traveling to Cuba who are already doing this kind of solidarity work, and that's a great way to get started. But there isn't just one terrain on which we're struggling against the blockade. We are struggling on the streets, we're struggling in the halls of Congress and our local governments and our workplaces and so much more. We're doing everything we can to lift this blockade. Definitely an urgent need in Cuba is access to supplies that they cannot buy because of the US blockade, especially medications. And Cuba has an incredible healthcare system. They have a higher life expectancy than the US. They have lower disease rates. They have lower infant mortality rates and just healthier people overall. But there are many shortages because the US blockade is preventing things from being imported. Even during COVID, the US blocked syringes and respirators from going to Cuba. And so the way they helped get around that was there was a massive solidarity campaign in the US that raised tens of thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands, to send syringes to Cuba. So the NNOC is a coalition of 57 different organizations. We have a full list on our website, NNOC.org. But all of those orgs, whether they're faith organizations, whether they're anti-war organizations or socialist parties, or just progressive groups in general, they're all working in different ways against the blockade. So I encourage people to check those orgs out, to get involved. And specifically, there's groups like IFCO Pastors for Peace, which is one of the longest existing Cuba Solidarity orgs. And they organize medical caravans every year to Cuba. So you can donate to them. You can go to one of their caravan stops before they head to Cuba in July. And they also facilitate the Elam Medical Scholarship for U.S. students to study for free at the medical school in Cuba, the Latin American School of Medicine. So those are just a couple things off the top of my head. But other ways we encourage people to support Cuba is passing resolutions in their local city council or in their labor union if they're part of one, demanding that the government end the blockade and take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. And I know, like, just from the outset, it might seem like, oh, passing a resolution is just a piece of paper. It doesn't actually change anything. But the process of organizing for a resolution can create, a local coalition of people organizing in support of Cuba. And the process of passing it can educate hundreds, thousands of people about Cuba. And then after that is passed, we've had city councils not only, send messages to Biden and to Congress and to their local representatives, pressuring them to end the blockade, but they also work towards building relationships and connections with Cuban institutions. So for example, I'm from Boston originally, and we've passed a lot of resolutions in cities around Greater Boston. And after that, they've worked to establish connections between healthcare institutions in Greater Boston and healthcare institutions in Cuba, universities in Boston and universities in Cuba, to try to, break the blockade, because that in itself is a defiance of the blockade. The US government does not want us even talking and exchanging with Cuban people at all. So there's a lot of different ways we can take action depending on what your skills are, what your interests are. And there's a lot of ways to get involved. And if you want to find out about them, go to NNOC.org or follow us on social media.
The one thing I would add also that's wonderful, Cal, is the kind of thing that's not seen and all that, is that the work that we do here in the United States is seen by the Cuban Revolution. It knows, it is plugged in and pays really close attention, because it has to, because when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world gets pneumonia. So it needs to pay close attention, and it sees the work we are doing. And seeing that work, it gives them strength to carry on too, right? So we have a relationship with them that helps. Our struggle is their struggle is our struggle, and we can fortify each other for the struggle that moves on. When they see us, which they will in the streets on June 25th, that's going to get them saying, I'm not alone in this struggle. We aren't alone. We aren't isolated. We have friends around the world. And that means a lot to people. That is food for the soul, just like anything else. And so we need to have more of that, right?
Absolutely. And I just want to add on quickly to what I was saying about the resolutions effort. Just as of last week, we've passed over 80 resolutions around the US, which represent over 50 million US people. And most recently, the Washington, D.C. City Council unanimously passed a resolution demanding to take Cuba off the terrorist list and to end the blockade. So it is very clear that the US people do not stand for this blockade, but it's a matter of if we organize ourselves and if we fight hard enough for our government to change the policy.
Going off of what Aeron had mentioned, you're saying that there's essentially a reciprocation of whether that's enthusiasm, energy, support, material support between U.S. workers in general, and the Cuban people through these solidarity efforts.
Absolutely.
Would you say that then there's also an impact domestically between people who are engaged in organizing in solidarity with Cuba and just the average worker who may not be organized or may not even be aware of the problems of capitalism?
I would just say, it goes both ways. The work that we are doing, struggling against imperialism in the US, it gives hope to Cuba, and it shows us we are there for them. And it also goes the other way. I think a lot of times when I've been in Cuba, I realize that the Cuban people, they have more hope for the US people to make a revolution than we necessarily do ourselves. And that's why traveling to Cuba is really important, because it shows us that a better world isn't just possible in some distant future, but that it already exists. And that could be possible for us if we make a revolution and unify like the Cuban people did. So that's really important too. And I think like being in political organizing, like on the left in the US, a lot of our struggle and just like our outlook on the world, sometimes it feels like it's like defined by hopelessness or this kind of like defeatist idea that we can never change anything, which it definitely does sometimes feel like, because the US ruling class is powerful and violent and repressive. But seeing what Cuba has done and how they have managed to keep their revolution strong despite being under the longest blockade in the history of the world, and despite, being barraged with CIA intervention, with assassination attempts, with literal invasion, that they've still survived, that gives me so much hope too.
A Cuban comrade, when I was in Cuba this last time, when we were on our 15th hour of meetings, and I said, man, I just need to take a rest. And he looked at me and he said, when you're sleeping, your enemy is still working. That is the Cuban way of organizing. It's invaluable for us in the United States to learn that, I think. Our enemy is always working. And the sense of fidelity to the just cause that the Cubans have for their sovereignty and the process, their revolutionary process, invigorates me in my political work here. I can take away that duty that they have, the sense of unity, the sense of what is necessary, what is a hill to die on, and what is not. And in the left in the United States, we love to die on our hills, right? Every hill is worth dying on. And to Cubans, sovereignty in their process is the hill that they die on. They'll talk to you about almost everything else. And I think that is an interesting way of thinking about what our work here is also. Do we have 2 or 3 fundamental points that we agree on, that keeps us in the room, that keeps us collaborating and organizing? If we do, let's keep working on those things. It's too important not to. And somebody else said this to me in Cuba was, Americans, get your shit together. The world is waiting for you. And that really struck with me. The world is waiting for us to land a blow. Let's get our shit together.
So it sounds like, being aware of the machinations of the U.S. and other Western capitalist countries against Cuba makes the issues at home clearer once you have a deeper understanding of how these systems operate internationally. I think about Canada and the way, for example, provinces are often pitted against each other. So as Calla knows, everyone kind of hates Quebec and Quebec hates everyone else. Alberta and BC are often pitted against each other, where there's kind of a provincial war, like, kind of our national identity is being Albertan or British Columbian or whatever, rather than a class war. Aeron, I kind of wanted to learn more about you. You work with the Michigan General Defense Committee. Could you briefly explain what this committee is and what work it's engaged in?
The Michigan General Defense Committee came around about 2019. Most of the primary organizers came out of a movement of anti-racist action, which was a militant street fighting group in the 80s and 90s. We're all a little bit older and wiser now, and wanted to bring some of that organizing experience that we had in anti-racist action. We had mass organizing. We had hundreds of chapters. We had 40,000 people on a mailing list before the internet. We fought the Klan and Nazis to a standstill. We learned a lot from that, a lot of what not to do. Anyway, when Trumpism kind of came back and the reactionary right, a lot of us talked about what we needed to do, and we wanted a higher level of politics than we had back then. But we still wanted the legitimacy that we had by working in the streets, in the communities, neighborhoods, apartment buildings, and workplaces. So we weren't in the clouds, we were in the mud. And we kind of took that idea. We are a non-sectarian anti-capitalist organization. So we have people that have no tradition at all or come from, like me, a Marxist tradition. And I have good comrades that come from the anarchist tradition that have been my comrades for decades. We have good, healthy debates. But we were just talking, all of us believe in eviction defense in organizing against police brutality. And so we try to organize on the areas that we agree on, and we try to have victories, because victories are extremely important to the revolutionary movement. And I would dare say a lot of young people, Calla's age or a little bit older, have never seen a victory before. And that tends to show up in their hopelessness or their defeatism. I have seen small victories of being able to say, like, beat the Klan off the streets, and those victories carry me. I understand what is possible. Cuba is a huge victory. Small victories are really important for the left. Go out and fight small victories. A good victory is worth 1,000 defeats. We are done being beaten. Let's win some. And so organize to win. And so that's our idea. We don't organize always to be right. We organize to win. And I think that's a different method. There's a time to be right. There's a time to clarify your politics in the struggle. There's also a time to win, and thinking about that. That's how we organize.
So coming from that background, Aeron, how did you get involved then with the NNOC, and what has that work been like from your perspective?
I was in Cuba 25 years ago. I lived there in 1997. I was there during the special period. I was there for International Youth Festival in 97 and decided to stay, and ended up living there for almost a year. I had some incredible experiences. And Cuba is always in my heart. And last year, when the May Day parade happened again for the first time since COVID, I looked on TV and said, why am I not there? And since then, I was looking for programs to get back to Cuba and found NNOC. And I'm so impressed with NNOC. The young people involved in organizing in NNOC are, and I'm going to put you on the spot, Cal, these kind of folks like Cal and Shaquille are the most dynamic people of their generation for political organizing. And it's just really impressive to see young people that aren't defeated, that aren't quiet, that aren't meek. It's just absolutely amazing. And with that energy, I think NNOC is hitting a lot of right notes right now. I'm really excited for the June 25th. We're bringing a van load full of comrades from Michigan. I want our comrades from Michigan that I organize with in the GDC to see how NNOC, the energy of NNOC and their commitment to their work, because like we said with the Cubans, that stuff is infectious. Defeatism is infectious, but also clarity and vision is infectious. So I want to be around people that are clear, bold, and swinging. And that's what we're doing. And NNOC is doing that. That's what's exciting about that.
So Aeron, have you already been on a trip through NNOC, or that is yet to come?
No, I was in the Mayday Brigade with the comrades. Yeah.
It sounds like, of course, you've been to Cuba. You've had the opportunity to live there for an extended period before that. But you can talk about either trip or experiences or both. So what is something that surprised you when you went there? And what's an experience that you'll remember?
Well, I think the fundamental thing that is the very immediately apparent thing is that capitalism is not the logic of the land when you go to Cuba. So there aren't billboards everywhere. There aren't a lot of hustlers everywhere. There isn't the speed in which capitalism works doesn't exist in Cuba, which is the first thing that you notice is that you don't have the grind anxiety when you step off the plane that you do when you step back into the United States, and you recognize that capitalism has a kind of spiritual and mental effect on you, and not just a physical beatdown of the grind. And I think also that you see that just for example, on the streets in the United States, the amount of untreated mental health crises that are constantly seeing, you don't see that in Cuba. And that's because the alienation that is so endemic in capitalism doesn't exist in Cuba. That doesn't mean there aren't problems in Cuba, that there aren't struggles, that people don't have bad days or bad weeks or bad months, because life is tough there. There's a blockade going on. It is an island nation that has been on the boot of an empire resisting an empire for 70 years. And in many ways, Cuba is held together by duct tape and string. But that ingenuity of the Cuban people to persevere gives me strength every time.
What's something you learned about Cuban socialism that you hadn't known before on this last trip?
I think the one thing that I will say is that was different than the time I was there before. When Fidel was in power, the trust that the people had to Fidel was really great. And since Fidel died in 2016, without that kind of anchor, right, that vision that Fidel brought, they've had to democratize in ways. They had to go directly to the people in ways that wasn't necessary because I think there was so much trust in Fidel. So this level of democratization that the Cubans have done to deepen their revolution has been really impressive. And I'll talk the family code and the assemblies and the popular consultations that happen are just light years ahead of any democratic processes we have in the United States. Like, that's not an exaggeration. It's real. And it's the way that nation has been able to sustain itself through all this adversity is because the people are directly involved in the decisions that are made on the ground. I remember when I was there last time, a municipality had gotten a pile of asphalt, and literally it was dumped in the neighborhood. And people pulled up chairs, and the neighborhood decided what to do with that asphalt. That was the democratic process, right? That's where democracy lives in Cuba, as opposed where I don't know where it is here, if it's anywhere. And that to me is the most impressive thing about Cuba.
So is there anything from your experience, from your learning, from your discussions with Cuban people that has inspired something specific you're going to take back to your work with the Michigan General Defense Committee?
The sense of a unity in the face of it in resistance, I think, is really important. Unity doesn't mean not disagreeing. It doesn't mean not having debates and discussions and promoting people's positions and allowing a minority to exist. But what it does mean is when time to act, the enemy is the capitalist and you are with the workers, right? Or so the society that we're trying to produce needs a unified struggle. Doesn't mean it's an agreeable struggle, but it's a unified struggle. And I think that is the most, again, I'll say this again, solidarity is an action verb. It's not a metaphor. It's work. And to bring solidarity into our work is going to be the most important. If we're going to win, and I want to win, I'm not interested in doing, I've been organizing for 30 years. I'm not interested in doing this so people can talk about me at my funeral. I want to win. I want the working class to win. And I'm going to organize for them to win. Not to be right, not to feel vindicated, to win.
Calla, a year ago, we had our first discussion where we talked about Cuba's democracy, and we compared it through the lens of abortion rights in the U.S. You also went into more information about the blockade, et cetera. I do recommend people check that episode out when they do have the chance. But correct me if I'm wrong here, but on the last trip that you did through the NNOC, you were not a co-chair of the organization, and currently you now are, which I assume means that you have a very, vital impact on the direction of the organization. So with that said, what were the highlights or what were the differences of this year's trip as co-chair of the organization?
Just to give a little context, my first trip to Cuba was a year ago. I went on the International May Day Brigade with the NNOC. I was 17, and I found out about that trip because I joined my local Cuba Solidarity Coalition in Boston, and the elders in that group who traveled to Cuba for the first time when they were teenagers, they encouraged me to go. And that trip was really life-changing for me, obviously, because I've come back several times since then, but also meeting so many elders from the US who've dedicated their lives to struggling against the blockade and against imperialism really inspired me to do the same. So then I was back in Cuba in December for the US-Cuba Youth Friendship Meeting, which was an exchange between US youth and Cuban youth from the Young Communist League and the Federation of University and High School Students. That was really amazing because we got to spend extended time with Cuban young people, regular teenagers like us. And then I was an NNOC co-chair then, but this was the first trip I did where I've actually been in the organization for a while, and I was one of the coordinators of our brigade. And it certainly was not an easy job. We had about 5 or 6 coordinators, but obviously it's a lot of logistical work, bringing together 60 people from all over the country, from different political organizations, backgrounds, all different ages, and bringing them to Cuba and then bringing them along the trip for 2 weeks. But it was really amazing. I feel like I learned a lot. And I guess one of the highlights of the trip was how valued I felt as a young person in Cuba, because young people are not valued in the US. Young people are labor to be exploited. And Cuba's a society that like really puts young people first, and young people are at the forefront of the revolution. Like I'll be talking to my Cuban friends who are my age, and they've like met and exchanged with their president multiple times to tell him their ideas and their concerns and whatnot. And so we got to meet the president while we were in Cuba. All the US brigades that were there on May 1st, we had a meeting with the president and the first secretary of the Cuban Communist Party, Miguel Diaz-Canel, and we got to address him directly and tell him about the work that the National Network on Cuba is doing to struggle against the blockade. And that was really incredible. I've obviously like never met a president before. I don't think Joe Biden would care to meet with me or any of us, but clearly Miguel Diaz-Canel does. And what he said during his speech after we all addressed him, he said that we, the brigadistas, show him that the US does not just bring bombs and blockades to Cuba, that we also bring solidarity. And I came back from the trip with so many ideas for what the NNOC can be doing to strengthen our work, and also with so much energy from the 60 people that we traveled with who were also transformed by this trip. And even though it was my third time in Cuba, like I still feel so transformed every time I come back, just getting to spend like a couple weeks in a revolutionary society. And especially what Aeron was talking about, like this message of unity, because that's something we don't have yet in the US. You know, we spend a lot of time fighting each other instead of working against our real enemy, which is US imperialism and the US ruling class. So that's something that I, came back with as like a top priority for building more unity in the Cuba solidarity movement, in the anti-imperialist left as a whole, and seeing how we can do that through the NNOC, because we're a coalition and we can expand, we can grow, we can bring so many more groups in and be doing so much more work if we're building capacity, if we're building cadre, and recruiting especially young people. So those are a couple of the highlights.
Following off of that, Calla, I was following the May Day Brigade's efforts and works on social media as the event was ongoing. And it looked like Chris Smalls, who I believe is the president of the Amazon Labor Union, was present. Did you travel with NNOC for that or through that organization?
No, so we did get to hang out with the Amazon Labor Union folks while we were in Cuba, which was awesome. But they were on a separate brigade. They were invited by the CTC, which is the Congress of Cuban Trade Unions. And they were invited as a labor delegation from union organizers across the US to learn about the labor movement in Cuba, which actually has like power and determination over their own futures. But that trip was organized by US Hands Off Cuba, based in LA, and they're an NNOC member organization. And I think it was really important that there were labor organizers traveling to Cuba, and they're not just traveling there, they're doing work now that they're back to end the blockade. The labor movement in the US needs to be anti-imperialist, because if you're not anti-imperialist, then you're not actually, fighting for the liberation of the working class. And I think, that's starting to change, and we're starting to see a lot more, working class people in the US realize the importance of exchanging with Cuban workers, of learning from the history of struggle in Cuba.
What is something new? Because, of course, you've now been there, it sounds like 3 times, this time as a co-chair. You met with the president. What is something new that you learned about Cuban socialism and the Cuban people?
First, I'd say this isn't necessarily something new that I learned, but every time I've come back to Cuba just in the past year, I've seen how much worse the blockade is getting. Just for an example, I was on the same May Day Brigade last year, but we were staying at the International Julio Antonio Mella camp, which is normally where all the international brigades stay. But because of the fuel shortages, all the plans had to be reworked. And so we were all staying in the city in Havana simply because there wasn't enough fuel to be transporting us back and forth. And fuel is what keeps the economy running. Students can't get to school, factories can't run. There is very limited public transportation because of these shortages. So what I took away from that is that, this is not sustainable. We have to end the blockade, not just in our lifetimes, but in the next few years, because there is going to be a breaking point. And I think something new that I learned about Cuban socialism is something really interesting to me is that when Cuban people talk about the revolution, they don't talk about the revolution starting in 1959 or even at the landing of the Granma yacht or even during Fidel's attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. They say it started in 1868 when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, who was a plantation owner in Cuba, freed his slaves and made the Declaration of Cuban Independence from the Spanish Empire, which started the first Cuban Independence War. And they see that as the start of their revolution. And the revolution is not over. It didn't end in 1959. It simply, seized state power, and now it is still, developing through just its first stages of socialism. And also I'll point out, obviously that shows there's a very different character of the Cuban Independence War and the Cuban Revolutionary Movement than there was in the US Independence War, because the Cuban Independence War was always tied to anti-slavery and anti-imperialism, unlike in the US. But what I've taken away from that is the importance of learning about the history of Cuba before the triumph of the revolution too, because there was a long, long history of organizing and struggle in Cuba, countless uprisings against slavery, against Spanish colonialism, against US neocolonialism. And, every time those uprisings would gain power, the US would come in and militarily occupy Cuba or covertly install a dictator who backed US interests or just massacre thousands of people. And Cuba overcame those defeats. They organized themselves and they unified the people. And that shows me that we in the US, despite having had so many defeats and failed uprisings, that we too can overcome those if we organize and if we win. So that's something I want to learn a lot more about, is not just the history of Cuba after 1959, but everything that led up to it and made the revolution and its victory possible.
Revolutions don't start and finish. They're just always in process.
Tying back to Cuba's history, something that the Communist Party of Cuba has done an amazing job on. Fidel did an amazing job with this. For the intervention in Angola and in other southern African countries by Cuba in the 70s and the 80s, I believe the Angolan one specifically was named Operation Carlotta, and that was named after an enslaved woman in the 1800s. I think Calla kind of hinted at one of these instances. And, she was a black woman. She fought against slavery. The Cuban Revolution saw her as an antecedent to their own efforts and really a mother of the movement.
You can see her portrait in Revolutionary Cuba is around too.
So yeah, I recommend people learning about Cuba's role in ending white supremacy in Southern Africa. I recommend Gerald Horne's book on the subject. I did have an opportunity to speak with him months ago now and had a discussion on them. I recommend you check out.
Cuba sent almost 5% of its population to Africa to struggle against colonialism and apartheid. This island nation in the Caribbean sent 5% of its population to struggle against that because they believe in internationalism. As Fidel would say, the imperialists can't understand why we would do this because they only do this stuff for oil or gold. So when we say it's internationalism, they can't comprehend that, but we can.
So Calla, the story that I started us off with about Jerry Rubin, he went to Cuba, met with Che, went back to the U.S., was energized to, get to work. And upon arriving back in the U.S., he had his passport revoked. From what I understand on this latest trip, several brigadistas were detained upon return from Cuba. Could you talk about this incident and what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. If I'm not mistaken, I think one of the brigadistas from our trip, Baba Charles, was on that same trip that you're mentioning from the US to Paris to Czechoslovakia to Cuba. He was one of the elders on our trip, and it was his first time back in Cuba since he'd been there in, I want to say 1964. Yeah, Aaron's nodding his head, so I think I'm right. And Baba Charles is based in Michigan now, so they're doing a lot of organizing together there, which is awesome. Yeah, the detainments of our brigadistas on May 7th are a continuation of a long history of repression and criminalization of the solidarity movement in the US with Cuba. The very first brigades that went to Cuba, like the one you mentioned, like the Venceremos Brigade, which is the longest running solidarity brigade starting in 1969, when those brigadistas came back to the US, often they'd have to come across the border with Canada because there were no direct flights to Cuba then. They would have all their belongings taken, their journals, their pamphlets, their photos. They would be followed and stalked by the FBI. Their parents would be interrogated and so much more. And so obviously it's not at that level quite anymore because now travel is legalized, tourism is technically still illegal, but they still want to, repress what we're doing. And the detainments this year were at a higher level than what we've seen in past years, which shows the strength that our movement is growing. So on May 3rd, some of the other brigades that were in Cuba came back that day. The International People's Assembly Brigade and the U.S. Hands Off Cuba Brigade, which I mentioned, they had several brigadistas detained for hours, belongings, electronics taken. And so we kind of had that foresight since our trip was a little longer when we came back, and we prepared our brigadistas to, go through customs safely so that we'd have no incidents. But we had 11 people pulled into secondary questioning, interrogated with questions that were clearly politically targeted. And they're doing this for a couple of reasons. One, just to intimidate us and scare us and try to stop us from what we're doing, which obviously isn't working. It's only making us more empowered. But they're also doing that, to find out things about who we are and what we're doing, which we obviously don't want them to know or to be able to infiltrate us or anything. But, people were detained. Someone had their phone taken, still hasn't gotten it back. Really just cruel, senseless harassment. And at the same time that our brigadistas, who were US citizens, were getting interrogated in secondary, they were also surrounded by many Cubans, Cuban citizens who were traveling to the US probably to visit family, who were also pulled into secondary and being harassed by customs agents who were just saying blatantly anti-communist things and being really cruel to these people they were interrogating. So I think the important thing we should be taking away from this is to keep organizing, to keep doing what we're doing, because obviously they want to stop us from doing it for a reason. And we have a right to travel to Cuba. We need to reaffirm that right. Tourism is illegal, but you can travel to Cuba. You have to get a license from the US to go. There's 12 different categories under which you can travel, but it's a lot easier than people think. And I think in general, if there's a country that the US is trying to keep you from traveling to, that's probably a good reason that you should go there and find out the truth about what is happening there. That's very true for Cuba. That's true for the DPRK. I wish we could go there, but we're banned by the State Department. And it's not Cuba that's trying to keep US people from coming there. They want us to come there. They want us to learn from their reality. So we will not be deterred. Solidarity cannot be criminalized, it cannot be blockaded, and we will always find a way to get to Cuba, just like the people did in the 60s when they had to fly to Paris and then Czechoslovakia.
When I went in the 90s, it was much harder, and I got stopped and held for 6 hours, and it's quite a bit easier now. Go. People in the United States, go. Canadians also go. The Cubans want and need you there. They not only need for you to see the reality, they need your hard currency that's being strangled from the blockade. It's a political act to go to Cuba, an act of solidarity for Canadians to spend money there. We can't as Americans, but you can. That's an act of solidarity, because the money you spend there will go into the institutions that are upholding the revolution. It will go into healthcare. It will go into schools and education. That's the difference. It's not going into a capitalist pocket to line, for them to buy another yacht. Go to Cuba, vacation there, see Cuba if you're Canadian, and if you're from America, go and see it for your own eyes to support the Cuban people.
Stay tuned for the second part of my discussion with Calla and Aeron, where we discuss the absurdity of Cuba being on the US's state-sponsored terrorism list, and what the NNOC and other organizations are doing to have Cuba removed from the list. Till next time.